Hello guys, this will be the video number 3 out of 3 free videos from my newest course about advanced testing in Laravel. And topic of today, if we scroll down the curriculum, it will be about faking the HTTP requests to third-party APIs, to external APIs, and how to test those. There are different ways how you can test those, so you would get the full picture if you watch the full course, and the link will be in the description below, but faking the HTTP client will be the topic of today's video, so let's watch that one. Tomorrow, the channel is back to typical daily videos, not from the courses. And this is where we get to kind of more advanced faking of stuff, which is faking external services and external APIs. This is probably the most tricky part of testing, and I get a lot of questions about that. So how to fake external service, how to mock that, and we will get into mocking in the next videos. But first, let's take a look at an example of open source project Monica, which fakes HTTP requests for external services and uses also a thing called fixtures for that. Fixtures is just pre-prepared sets of data. If we take a look at tests fixtures folder, there's helpers and services, and inside we have JSON kind of prepared sets of data. IP data JSON contains example response from external service about IP. So IP address should contain this example information. And they prepared that as a JSON file. It's kind of like a template. Then another example inside of fixtures is create place sample response, and that uses location IQ com service. Another thing, get weather information sample response. Again, this is example response coming from weather API. So these are JSONs prepared probably after some testing requests or from their API documentation. Now, how those JSON responses are used. If we get back to the example of IP data JSON, it can be found in this test, request helper test, get infos from IP. And let's take a look what it does. First, it overrides the config. So config token value is set to test. So we don't expose and don't use the live token of that service. And that service is ipdata.co. And then we use HTTP fake. So another fake like mail fake, like notification fake, and all of those fake things that we used previously in this section. It's kind of the same thing, but with more stuff on top. So you can fake the requests to these set of URLs. So whatever request with asterisk to API ipdata.co would be faked with response. And that response comes, guess from where? The body comes from ipdata JSON, which we saw just a minute ago. So in other words, we reiterate, we fake the API requests, we fake the HTTP client requests to API ipdata, so it would not make the real request, but instead it would return this. And then we assert that request helper infos return this country, currency, and time zones. What is inside of that request helper infos? This is the function of infos by IP. And interestingly, this project uses two possible solutions, two API services to get the data by IP. So if we use IP stack API key, then this happens. But otherwise, if we have IP data token, which we do have, but it is set to test. Remember here, config, we override the config, which means that this method would execute this part, and then we try to get the IP data, which would make the HTTP request, and then return the data into position, which would then be caught in our assert equals. If we take a look at get IP data, what is inside? We have exactly that HTTP get from API ipdata.co, and this would be overridden in our test by this line of HTTP fake. So again, if some of your methods make HTTP client request to external service, you may override that request so it wouldn't happen, the actual HTTP request. Instead, you override that with response that you hard code, possibly potentially in separate JSON file. You don't necessarily have to call it fixtures. It may be template stubs or whatever, or it may be just a variable inside of the same function. But this is an example of faking the external API, the external service request, if it's just HTTP client request. Another example from the same repository with a different JSON and a bit more complex in terms of what files are touched. So from location IQ, they get that JSON, which is used in this test, stores a place, and fetch geolocation information. So again, we get that JSON and we fake the request to location IQ to return that. The actual HTTP request, HTTP client call for the API happens here. App create place. Create place is a service class which has execute method. Inside of that execute method, it has get geocoding info. Inside of that, it dispatches a job which may be into the queue get GPS coordinates. That job is here, and that job inside of that has another service to execute. And that service in itself, it's also pretty complex, but in terms of execution, it does this query, and query is the layer where the actual HTTP GET request is executed. So it's deep down below, a few files deep, but the essence is the same. In terms of testing, you do HTTP fake, then somewhere along the lines of executing something, the HTTP call happens, which is faked by this response.